Before Wall Street had skyscrapers and before Silicon Valley minted modern billionaires, a company existed that could declare war, sign treaties, print money, and run its own prisons. While paying dividends to citizens back home, it didn't just move products, it moved empires. Every headline that sounds extreme today, monopolies that strangle markets, lobbying that rewrites law, insider trades dressed as strategy. Shareholder revolts against distant executives had a prototype centuries ago. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, turned the sea lanes of Asia into a balance sheet and proved that a corporation, given the right legal armor and enough cannons, could behave like a state. The question is not simply how a trading house rose so high. The deeper question is why the modern world still runs on its blueprint. Travel to Amsterdam in 1602. The Dutch Republic is young, defiant, and surrounded by rivals who already control the richest trade in the world. Asian spices and luxury goods carry margins so high they can redraw maps. Dutch merchants have tried competing voyage by voyage. Each expedition an isolated gamble with profits split on the docks and crews scattered afterward. Scale is impossible that way. Capital dissolves between trips. Knowledge leaks with every sailor who changes ships. The workaround becomes a revolution. Merge the ventures into one permanent joint stock company and sell pieces of it to the public. Not a temporary partnership, not a royal household office, a creature the world has never truly seen, permanent, transferable, and hungry. The States General grants the charter and goes further still. Exclusive rights east of the Cape of Good Hope. The legal authority to build forts, raise armies, make war, mint coins, and govern conquered territories. The line between merchant and sovereign blurs in the moment the ink dries. At home, another invention clicks into place. A market for the company's shares, open to ordinary citizens who can buy and sell their stake without waiting for captains to unload cargo. Risk that once sank. Individuals with their ships can now be diversified across a sea of paper claims. Future profits are pulled into the present, and a ledger becomes a time machine. Boards and bylaws follow as form must fit function. Regional chambers provide ships and cash, Amsterdam, Zealand, and others, each staffed by directors with local loyalties. Above them sits a council of power, the 17 gentlemen, the first recognizable board with empire-wide oversight. They choose commanders, approve fortifications, juggle budgets, and set dividends. The agendas look familiar to any modern executive, except that sometimes the discussion ends with deciding which island to bombard. Standardization spreads like rigging across a deck. Ship designs, contracts, accounting methods. Logistics becomes theology. With the ability to impose routine on a world of currents, the company extracts a new commodity from chaos: predictability. But predictability is engineered, not discovered. The VOC builds a capital, Batavia, present-day Jakarta, after a brutal campaign that removes the previous inhabitants and installs a corporate city with walls, warehouses, and gallows. From there, a lattice of forts and factories stretches to the horizon, the Cape at Africa. Tip to water and repair fleets, Ceylon for cinnamon, Malacca to command the straits, Dejima for the narrow doorway into Japan. The map of posts and anchorages looks like a trade network. On the ground, it feels like coercive logistics. Convoys keep to the monsoon as if obeying a fiscal calendar. Warehouses fill and empty to match European auction seasons, not local need. Prices are squeezed at the source, spread across the voyage, and squeezed again at the destination. Contracts do the work when they can. Gunports help when they can't. In the islands, where nutmeg and cloves grow, then the most valuable flavors on earth, scarcity is not a fact of nature, but a policy. Rivals are blocked by charter and by canon. If crops exceed the plan, surplus is burned to keep prices high. Independent sellers who slip a handful of cloves past the system are made examples of in ways that leave villages emptied and fields salted with fear. The myth that markets are peaceful by design dissolves in the smoke of a guarded monopoly. The VOC doesn't compete on price or service when it can reorganize the world so competition cannot exist. Meanwhile, the miracle in Amsterdam continues. A forum where shares trade while ships are still at sea, each rumor and arrival adjusting prices like tides. Dividends flow in coins when coffers are full and, at times, in spices, when logistics or liquidity make cargo a more convenient currency. A household might receive its payout as sacks that smelled of nutmeg and clove. Yield becomes a sensory experience, yet markets require suspicion to stay healthy, and suspicion appears early. A shareholder publicly accuses directors of opacity, self-dealing, and reckless empire building. He pushes for audits, for clear accounts, for a say proportional to ownership. Today, this looks like activism. Then, it looked like insubordination. The argument that still defines capitalism, who management serves, and how much investors deserve to know, was already raging along Amsterdam-Urenki-S canals. From Batavia outward, the company perfects a formula: seize choke points, secure sources, enforce exclusivity, move goods along a private thoroughfare of forts and ships. Auction in a home market starved by design. This is not the romance of open competition. This is market manufacture. Scarcity becomes profitable only when it can be kept scarce. A trader calculates margins. A sovereign writes the rules. The great innovation of the VOC is that one entity could be both. Years pass, ships rot, forts crumble, and costs mount. Distance is a tax paid in wood, iron, and lives. Soldiers must be paid and fed. Garrisons eat margins. Captains skim. Local governors broker private deals. Warehouse clerks shave scales and swap inventory. These are the eternal principal agent problems of any sprawling organization. Each small leak invisible until the ship rides lower in the water. Wars erupt against local polities, Asian rivals, and European competitors who have learned the same lessons and are now willing to test them at cannon range. War consumes not just powder but credit. Dividends can be maintained for a time through financial engineering. Borrow here, pledge inventories there, roll obligations forward. Call it sustainability. But ledgers are judges with long memories. The question that haunts modern earnings calls, growth or margin, eventually becomes neither. Maintenance swallows both. Behind the columns and profit lines hides a human ledger written in hunger, fear, and forced movement. Single crop mandates pushed onto villages create dependencies that fail in bad seasons. Famines sometimes follow policy rather than weather. Local rulers who resist are removed or replaced. Those who comply rise within a hierarchy that pays loyalty well and dissent with iron. Work that appears like employment in neat retrospective tables looked like coercion on the ground. The company is not unusually cruel for its time. It is typically cruel, and its scale gives that cruelty a machine's efficiency. Back in Europe, trust things as rumors multiply. Investors push for transparency. Directors try to reveal enough to pacify markets without giving critics the rope to hang the machine. Reputation begins to swing from asset to liability. Merchants in Asia learn to play the VOC off against its rivals. Political factions in Europe discover that the company's scandals are useful ammunition in unrelated fights. Scale, which once smothered competitors, now amplifies every flaw. A stumble no longer trips a room, it shakes a continent. The unraveling is long. Monopolies fail at the edges. Smuggling becomes a shadow mirror of the official supply chain, sometimes faster, often cheaper, and too diffuse to kill. Rivals. English, Portuguese, indigenous powers adapt. Consumers back home change tastes and move their money. Forts that once guaranteed price now guarantee only expense. The company survives by habit, long after it has stopped innovating by design. Eventually, the state that granted the charter absorbs what remains. Assets move into public hands. Debts settle on the same books that once gave life to the giant. The creature that acted like a country becomes part of a country again. This is not irony, it is revelation. Corporation and state were never separate. They were co-authors of the same story. Why does a 4-century-old corporation matter now? Because its blueprint still hides inside modern systems under different labels. Finance remains the force multiplier. Public markets transform distant profits into present power, allowing organizations to wage multi-year campaigns with today's cash based on tomorrow's prospects. Monopoly remains the grail, not merely by owning a product, but by controlling a bottleneck. Ports then, platforms now, straits then, standards now. Once the choke point is in hand, a firm stops competing and begins dictating. Regulation remains a strategy, not a constraint. Yesterday, S-Charter is today, S-footnote in a 1,000-page rulebook that serves as armor for those who know how to read it. Narrative remains currency. Disclose enough to reassure, never so much that the public can compute the true cost of scale. Externalized costs remain the quiet subsidy of empire. Profits captured at the center, while risk and damage spread to the periphery, whether those costs are measured in forests, cut for spice plantations, or in attention harvested to sell ads. Reputation remains a fragile treasury. When it shines, credit flows. When it cracks, liquidity evaporates faster than the ink on a quarterly statement. Strip away the wooden hulls and canvas sails and the silhouette still looks familiar. A platform that extracts value by managing access, information, and enforcement. Replace clove trees with data centers, forts with server farms, charters with antitrust loopholes, and the line from then to now becomes a straight edge. Power compounds quietly through routines, warehouses and convoys then, APIs and subscriptions now. The strongest systems are not the ones that shout about dominance, but the ones that make dominance feel like normality. Yet there are deeper lessons that deserve a place beside the warnings. First, watch for power that presents itself as efficiency. The VOC didn't announce an empire. It announced standardized ships, tidy ledgers, and predictable auctions. The predictability was engineered by reshaping the world to fit a balance sheet. Today's efficiencies often hide similar reshaping. When margins look impossibly smooth, find who absorbs the turbulence on the other side of the contract. Second, remember that monopoly profits are moral claims disguised as arithmetic. A dividend line that climbs year after year often signals a geography of silence somewhere else. That silence might be a producer squeezed beyond sustainability, a community locked into a single point of failure, or a regulatory environment bent by influence into an obstacle course for would-be competitors. Third, treat too big to fail as a lullaby. Scale buys time, not immortality. History is a ledger of giants that assumed gravity was a rumor. The VOC also explains why the corporate form became irresistible to states. It externalized risk while internalizing reach. It could be blamed for atrocities, and yet taxed for its profits. It spread the ideology of the ledger. If it pays, it is rational, and trained elites to think in consolidated statements rather than communities. Once the technique existed, nothing prevented its application to mines, plantations, railways, telegraphs, oil fields, and eventually networks. Each industry adopted its own version of forts and convoys, patents, pipelines, cables, server racks, and each struck bargains with governments to align law with profit. A charter in the 17th century is an API policy today. Both are invisible architectures that decide who may enter, on what terms, and at what price. Even the celebrated innovations of the Amsterdam market carry warnings for modern eyes. Liquidity is a blessing until it invites leverage that outruns judgment. Shares that can be traded every day encourage horizons that collapse to the next quarter, the next voyage, the next rumor. Dividends paid in kind help the VOC keep confidence alive. Today's equivalents are buybacks that shape price as much as they reward patience. In each case, the surface looks like a reward for investment. The underside is support for the narrative that sustains the machine. Critics then asked for audits, for limits on director terms, for rules against trading on privileged information. The pushback they met is familiar. Transparency will harm competitiveness. Critics don't understand the complexity of operations. Trust leadership to manage what the public cannot see. Enough was revealed to quiet the crowds without surrendering the engine room. Too little was revealed to prevent the slow sinking that followed. Governance, like ballast, is invisible until it isn't. The human stories remain the truest measure. Families ordered to tear out food plots to plant cash crops for a market thousands of miles away. Sailors who signed contracts with clauses they could not enforce across oceans. Clerks who understood that a small lie in a ledger could feed a household, and that, multiplied across an empire, such lies became a culture. Local rulers who traded autonomy for silver and found, too late, that sovereignty bought with corporate coin devalued faster than trust. These are not relics. They are recurring patterns in different dresses. They caution against applause for growth that pretends to be neutral. No growth is neutral when it requires the power to rearrange lives at scale. There is a temptation to view the VOC purely through the lens of villainy. That lets the present off the hook. The more disturbing insight is that the company functioned because it aligned incentives across government, investors, managers, and consumers. It promised the state strategic leverage against rivals. It promised citizens a way to participate in the empire from a safe distance and collect returns. It promised managers status and riches. It promised consumers exotic goods at prices that felt like progress. When so many constituencies benefit, scrutiny struggles to gain purchase. That is how systems last. Not by hiding their nature, but by making their costs feel remote and their benefits immediate. The end, when it came, looked less like collapse than like a soft transfer of obligations. The company's balances bled into the state's accounts. The walls of forts housed different soldiers. The ships sailed under new paperwork. Investors who had grown used to the hum of dividends learned that habit is not a covenant. Communities that had been reorganized for spice found themselves reorganized again for other commodities. The machine stopped being called a corporation in one moment and started being called policy in the next. Power rarely dies, it molts. So when headlines today announce that a platform is indispensable to national success, when executives argue that their scale makes them partners of governments rather than subjects, when a market seems too valuable to be allowed to fail, even after breaking the systems that fed it, remember the Spice Islands. Remember Batavia's walls and the ledgers that justified them. Remember shareholders applauding as sacks of nutmeg counted as dividends, while villages counted losses in silence. Consider how law can launder violence simply by naming it a charter, a compliance program, or a terms of service update. Consider how markets will believe in anything as long as the payments arrive on time. Power compounds quietly. It builds routines that look innocent up close, shipping schedules, software updates, subscription renewals, until the routine itself becomes the source of authority. By the time most people notice, the structure is declared inevitable, yet nothing here is inevitable. It is engineered, argued for, voted on, and enforced. The VOC proves that a corporation can become a political instrument, and it also proves that political instruments can be unmade. The courage required is not the drama of a sea battle, but the dull persistence of governance done well. Audits that cut against interest, courts that cannot be lobbied into sleep, citizens who refuse to confuse convenience with consent. Balance this with one final clarity. The story of the world's first megacorporation is not a museum piece. It is a mirror. It shows how finance can assemble power faster than traditional politics, how law can grant coercion a polite uniform, and how trust, once the engine of commerce, can be harvested as a commodity until nothing remains but compliance. If the era seems different now because the tools are digital and the products invisible, remember that the core remains the same. Control the bottleneck, mold the narrative, externalize the costs, and let dividends mask the damage. When a company claims neutrality while shaping the terrain on which everyone else must move, look for the fortified warehouses behind the marketing language. When growth seems frictionless, trace the frictions that were pushed elsewhere. When leadership insists that scrutiny will weaken the system, recognize the confession hidden in the plea. The Dutch East India Company didn't invent greed or conquest. It invented a structure that could scale them with unprecedented efficiency. That structure survived long after its flags came down. History has the answers. Look where power hides.